My first topic for today is going to be a book review of Lord of the World, which is a classic dystopian novel from 1907. And not many people have heard of this book. In fact, I think the only way I heard of it was I was looking at Wikipedia's list of dystopian literature, and I noticed this one was kind of near the top. Wikipedia's list shows a list of novels or stories that have a dystopian flavor to them, sort of a dark and pessimistic view of the future and or technology. And Lord of the World was one of the earlier books in this genre. In our pilot season, I talked about We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, and that was a book from 1921. So Lord of the World predates that by a decade or two. So I thought, hey, that would be an interesting one to read. I've just started getting into the dystopian genre, and I'm finding it really interesting to read it as sort of a reflection of history and the things people have feared or thought or predicted based on their experiences in the past, and then seeing how this genre has progressed over time from back, in the 19th century all the way to the present day. So I was very excited to find another book from that earlier era when they really didn't have as much technology as we do now, and they had to be a lot more creative with their futuristic predictions. I would say there's two types of authors in the world. There's authors who write mainly for readers, for the consumers, for the market, to be able to sell their books and make a living, those kind of authors. Then there's authors who mainly write for themselves. They have a message they want to share, and they're going to write it down even if nobody reads it. And I feel like Lord of the World is the kind of book that the author wrote because it was the book he wanted to read. And to understand this book, I think we need to understand the author. And the author is a man named Robert Hugh Benson. 3 things to know about Robert Hugh Benson. He was born in 1871. He was a contemporary of Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle, and G.K. Chesterton, who was a fellow Catholic. Benson, it should be noted, was a Catholic priest, although before that he was an Anglican. In fact, his conversion was quite, it made the headlines back then because it was so shocking to people. He was the son of an Anglican archbishop, so for him to convert to Roman Catholicism was a really big deal back then. He came from a highly educated family. He had 2 brothers who were also authors, and his conversion was a major point in his life. And I believe that he wrote Lord of the World sometime after that. Lord of the World has been mentioned by 2 popes, actually. The previous pope, Pope Benedict XVI, he references this book as a cautionary tale against New World Order. And the current Pope Francis recommended it as recently as 2015. As an example of the concept of, quote, ideological colonization. Now, I'm not going to get into that topic necessarily, but I will link to that article in this post description because I thought it was kind of interesting to see what Pope Francis thought about this book and why he chose to bring it up. So you have a novel that has a very highly, spiritual author, someone with very strong convictions about the world, and someone who is very in tune to the ideologies of his day. So he brings all of these things to the table in Lord of the World and in the main character, Percy Franklin. I'll talk about him in a moment, but I just wanted to first talk about the setting of Lord of the World and the ideologies that Robert Hugh Benson talks about in this book. So the setting of the Lord of the World, sorry, I keep wanting to say that. Lord of the World. There's no the at the beginning. The setting of Lord of the World is in some indefinite 21st century year. You've got 3 major groups, and those 3 states are, number 1, America, which is basically the North, Central, and South Americas combined. You've got communist Europe, which includes parts of Africa, because colonization still happened in this world. And then you've got the, quote, Eastern Empire, which is kind of a joint empire of China and Japan. So those are the three political bodies in this story. America is essentially America of today. Communist Europe, of course, has come under Marxist doctrines, and the Eastern Empire has some religion going on, but it's kind of becoming less and less powerful in spite of the joining of the two cultures, or maybe because of that. The rise of the Labor Party and the rise of socialism and communism are some really big themes in this book. And from Benson's point of view, these were negative things. He, of course, comes from a religious perspective, and he views those ideologies as contradictory and opposition to religion, be that Catholicism, which is his personal belief, but also Buddhism, Sufism, and other Eastern religions. On a global sphere, the communists are trying to bring humanism and atheism to all the different countries and sort of wipe out all religious thought and belief. One thing I noticed about the Christianity in this book is that he makes a point of pointing out that Protestantism has faded from popularity, so you really don't have that many Protestants. Basically, they're just fringe groups by this time, and the true Christians are mainly Catholics, and most of them are actually living near or in Rome. So that's one of the aspects of this book that may not come kindly to some of its readers if you're not coming from a Catholic perspective, but maybe you're coming from a Protestant perspective. But it's just worth noting the author's background and, again, the fact that he was kind of writing for himself in a way and putting down his thoughts into a story. So let's get into the characters a bit. We are in England of the 21st century. Our main protagonist is a young man named Father Percy Franklin. So he is a Catholic priest. He's very frustrated by what he sees as a dying church, and he feels pressured, of course, by society to conform to the new wave of humanism and atheism. He becomes entangled in some events regarding a member of parliament, a leftist member of parliament, named Oliver Brand. And what gets really important here is that Oliver's mother is a woman returning to her Catholic faith. So she reaches out to Percy and is trying to get back into her faith and back into the church, essentially. Then you've got Oliver's wife, Mabel, who is fully devoted to her husband and fully devoted to his causes. But she too has some reservations about this new world order, so to speak. And then above all, we have our antagonist, this mysterious man named Julian Felsenburgh, who is an American senator, and what makes him special is he has an uncanny ability to bring people together. And that becomes significant as the plot develops and as the political atmosphere heats up in London. This book, in a way, reminded me of Heart of Darkness, and not so much in the writing style, because Conrad is more symbolic, whereas Benson here is more straightforward in his prose. But I felt like there was some contrast between Percy Franklin, the priest, and Julian Felsenburgh, the senator. For one thing, they have this physical trait that makes them similar, which is their white hair, their unusually white hair for their age. And there was just something I thought that he was trying to do there, contrasting the two sides of this political ideological spectrum in these two young men, which he did intentionally. I think Benson could have done a little more with that. I was a little disappointed he didn't take it farther and maybe flesh out the plot and the interactions between them, but I won't say anything more about that. I just thought that it was kind of a missed opportunity to do something a little more dramatic, I guess, in the way that Conrad contrasted Marlowe and Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. But anyway, I'm getting a little sidetracked there. One description that really caught my attention was Felsenberg, who is described as very nice. He's a very nice guy. He's not like a Hitler-esque type of character. It says, quote, "His originality lay in his clean hands and his stainless past. That and his magnetic character. He was the kind of figure that belonged rather to the age of chivalry, a pure, clean, compelling personality, like a radiant child." So that really sums up the extreme popularity of Felsenberg and his ability to make friends with anyone, to influence anyone, and make them bend to his will in a somewhat supernatural sense. And that gets expanded upon as the book goes on, but I don't want to talk about any spoilers. One of my rules for my podcast, if you weren't with me in the pilot season, I talked a little bit about some rules for my podcast. And one of them is I'm trying not to divulge any major plot spoilers or anything that is best found out if you read it yourself. I think it's really important for readers to come to those points at their own time and not go into a story knowing all that stuff. So I'm going to try not to divulge major spoilers. But there's lots to talk about in a book without talking about plot twists. I think, especially in a book like Lord of the World, you've got a very meaty framework for a story where all these ideas and fears and predictions that Benson was musing over, and the kind of movements he was seeing in his own day with communism and so forth, those kind of things really make up the bulk of this type of story. And it's really in the plot where you might see examples of it, but it's still going to be there outside of the plot. Is it really realistic to have this type of guy, this Felsenberg, rise to the top and suddenly become one of the major rulers of the world? I would say that based on what we're currently seeing in our social and political spheres, I would say that Felsenberg is not like, there's no exact parallel for him in current 21st century politics, but this concept of a one-party system and of young politicians rising to the top or outsiders to politics suddenly coming in, I mean, I think we're seeing those things in our daily lives, and I don't know, it's something that people were thinking about 100 years ago, and it's something we should bear in mind even today. And indeed, some countries do have one-party systems, so it's not something for us to get freaked out about, but it's just interesting to see how history repeats itself, and really nothing is new. Everything comes around. So I want to go over a few points that I really liked about the book. The first thing that really struck me was Percy Franklin, the protagonist, and his struggle. He does not have a perfect confidence in himself or in the future. And based on all the horrible things that are happening around him, you can see why. Over time, he learns that you must have a will to believe in God and that God will help you preserve your faith, but that it's not about emotions. So Felsenberg's followers start to worship him like a god, basically. And they go into these very emotional frenzies. And the thing is, Franklin learns that's not what faith is. Faith isn't getting emotionally worked up and weeping tears or feeling these moments of like heroism. It's not that. In fact, faith is very simply having trust and relying on God. Even if you don't feel anything, that doesn't mean you don't have faith. And so that's something that Franklin has to learn. He's a very real character because he does get afraid and he does waver. He does get overwhelmed by reality and the changing world around him and everything that's being told to him and the propaganda, all those things versus his very simple beliefs. I really liked that about him. He's not like a perfect character. He has his doubts and he has a constant struggle. And I think that's really quite an incredible character to have, especially in Christian fiction. I think that's important to show that it is a journey. It's not like you're going to be always confident all the time and that you're not going to have moments of weakness. So yes, Percy Franklin is a very well-written character, and I can only assume that there are some autobiographical elements in his character arc. The other thing that really rang true for me in this book is the spiritual side of it, which is a continuous thread throughout the narrative. Not only are the Catholics struggling in this book and waging, spiritual warfare by being strong, but the atheists invent their own religion, which is basically a worship of Felsenburgh and an outward expression of their humanism. And I think sometimes there are books where it seems like only the religious people are religious, but when you think about what religion really is, it's, what's the most important thing in your life? What will you put as a priority over all else? And I think everybody has that, whatever it is. And here, it's formalized. The atheists formalize a religion and practice it, repurposing churches and other Christian buildings for their religion. In the opening quote, it was mentioned that war was extinct. And that is another concept in this book that kind of surprised me, but made a lot of sense. And it was the concept of world peace gone wrong. The idea of finding world peace, if you will, through humanist measures instead of through God. And the way that plays out is really there's no world peace. It's just a redefinition of what peace is. And honestly, that seems pretty realistic to me. How many times in history have we seen these dystopias, which were supposed to be utopias, because some guy said, hey, let's do everything my way and everything will turn out fine. And just getting people to go along with that at the expense of minorities and people that were not part of that scheme. So you can have world peace, but it's relative. And that's one of the topics that he goes over at some length in this story. As far as the futuristic side of Lord of the World, there were a few predictions that were pretty much on point. For example, one of my favorite scenes was when Percy is traveling on an airship, and just the way that it was described I thought was pretty true to life as far as like airplane flight. And I thought that was pretty impressive. I don't know if Robert Hugh Benson ever flew on an airship, but he got it down right. Sort of that surrealist, almost mystical feeling of being in the air and looking outside and seeing the world in a different form and from a different perspective. I wish he had done a little more like that in this book. Obviously, that wasn't his focus. He wasn't focusing so much on science, but on society. But I was pretty impressed by that scene, and I think he could have done a lot more if he had chosen to go that route. Related to airships, another thing Benson accurately predicted was the use of airstrikes. And airplanes were not used for warfare till about 1911, and they weren't actually used in a major way till World War I, so to be predicting this in 1907 is pretty impressive. Terrorism is another 21st century tactic that Benson refers to in his book. And that's not so much a prediction as it is just, he's confirming that he still believes it'll be something that is used going forward in the future. He cites Esperanto as the universal language, and while we're not speaking Esperanto, we do have a universal language essentially in English. Certainly there are many countries that do not have English as a first language, but nonetheless it is used primarily in business, and it doesn't seem to be going away. Finally, there was one quote by the humanists that I thought is pretty true to the modern day, and they said, quote, "We cannot be wrong if we follow nature." So there's this idea propounded by Felsenburgh that Mother Nature is the only truth, and that we must infer morality from her laws. Basically, that's how they justify a lot of their cruelty and the brutality and all the bad things that they want to implement. I do see that in the modern day to some extent. Lots of times or society, I should say, looks to nature as some kind of example, although clearly nature has its own brutality. So again, not a direct parallel maybe to the modern day, but there's certainly some themes there that have carried forward and that we should be cautious of. Benson does miss a few predictions, or I should say fails to make some predictions. For example, it's sort of like Zamyatin and we. He seems to think we'll still be using paper products for basically everything. We'll still be writing letters and using the telegraph. He doesn't seem to envision computers and automation as being a huge part of our lives. Now, the one place that he does talk about automation is when they're sitting at dinner, and this is Oliver Brand, the politician, and his wife Mabel and her mom. They're all sitting around at dinner or lunch or something, and the table comes down from the ceiling with all the food on it. So, now that actually reminded me of a very similar device in Jules Verne's book, Paris in the 20th Century, where they also have this table that either pops up or comes down or something. And I just think it's kind of funny that they both thought of the same type of automation for something that we don't have today, or at least not commonly. It's just kind of interesting to see what they thought would happen in our everyday lives. And in Benson's world, paper is still very much a main conveyor of information. Can't really criticize him for that, but it was just kind of interesting. The other thing that Benson didn't really predict was the women's rights movement taking off in the 20th century. And here you see some women. There's Mabel and her mother-in-law, and they're not really very different from a Victorian woman. I mean, Mabel is very submissive to her domineering husband, and she's much, much younger than him. And you just don't feel like that he realized what feminism would do. And I would say the same in We by Zamyatin. He really didn't see feminism as changing women's roles that drastically. So I thought that was an interesting missed prediction or missed opportunity for one. Another anachronism, I would say, in the book is he predicts pastors and priests basically abdicating their churches as opposed to secular thought being integrated into religion. And here I thought that the 21st century is different than what he envisioned. I think today, and most people would probably see this, our churches are much more secularized. And it's not so much that pastors or priests are leaving churches, but churches are changed. They're not as orthodox, little o orthodox, as they used to be. Maybe if we had continued on the lines that we were back in 1907, maybe it would have turned out the way Benson predicted, where everyone's more just super segregated. But I kind of think that that's one of the effects of globalism. And if he had just connected those two dots, he might have been able to predict this as well. That people become integrated with each other. Even though we do have trouble today with conflict and tension, we're still very much integrated with each other. In terms of religion, it's not always a good thing, because then you fall at a risk of prioritizing secular ideas over religious ones, over Bible-based truths. And then speaking of truths, he kind of predicts that truth is replaced with an alternative truth. And I would say that what we have today is more of a corruption of truth. And maybe it's semantics, but I think today there's so much more question about what does something mean? What do words mean? What do beliefs mean? And there's so much this desire for many people to pick things apart and maybe find different meanings than people did in the past, for good and worse. And I think Benson foresaw instead something more like all those things being thrown away and new ideas being inserted into society, kind of like nihilism, which was a big movement in the 19th century. I wouldn't say that's actually come about today. He essentially predicts religious self-segregation, and he sees the very devout Christians moving to Rome or to the outskirts of Rome. And I don't really see that happening in Western society, although possibly in other countries it is more segregated. I don't know if we could become more like his vision of the future in our future. I'm not sure if that can happen at this point. I think we are so very interconnected with each other, secular and sacred, and country and country. It's not likely that we will ever be as grouped off as we have been in the past. Although, I could be wrong. One thing that these dystopian novels tell you is nobody can predict the future 100%. History does repeat itself, but sometimes it comes back with a slight variation, or it takes a different route, a different repetition than someone thought it did in the past. Lord of the World was an interesting book. I think the second half was better than the first. I felt like the first was very based on the protagonist's fears and just sort of building up atmosphere, but I didn't really connect to it very well. There's more plot in the second half, and I thought it was stronger because of that. Benson, the author, has a unique viewpoint as a Catholic priest, and I think it's both his strength and his weakness. On the one hand, he makes some great points, but there was also a lot of the book I just couldn't relate to, especially in terms of the status of the Pope and the kind of eminence that Benson gives the Pope. I couldn't relate to that personally because I'm not Catholic, or maybe because I'm not a priest. Again, I think he was writing this book for himself as a reflection of his thoughts. I'm not sure that many readers will be able to connect to what he wrote. And the writing style is not as great compared to Chesterton or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's kind of got this self-conscious quality to it, and it kind of becomes ponderous at times when the subject matter should be really a little more fast-paced and driven. I still think it's worth reading, especially as a companion to We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. The fact that it precedes that book also, I think, makes it worth reading. So you can see how these same fears, these same uncertainties about these ideologies and new thoughts had affected people in different countries in Europe. So I do recommend it with reservations. It is free to read on Project Gutenberg, so if you decide to read it, I hope you will let me know what you think. And let me know if you find any other old classic dystopian novels that I should check out.